And we're going to say welcome once again to Dr. Lea Taragin-Zeller. Very, very warm welcome to her. She's joining us today from Israel, where she's currently on a kibbutz in North Israel. And she's actually about to start a really exciting sounding new research project at Technion, which is a sort of major sort of scientific research institute in Israel. But Lea is also currently a research fellow affiliated with the Woolf Institute in Cambridge. And she is a social anthropologist whose research explores the everyday intersections of science and technology and religion and gender, particularly in relation, as far as I understand, to reproduction and to education. And she has also done extensive and really interesting fieldwork among religious minorities in Israel and the UK. And I believe she's going to tell us a little bit about some of her research on the latter this afternoon. So welcome, Lea, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Liana, for the kind invitation and for the introduction. It's really a pleasure to share my findings with everybody today. Like everything now in our life, it would have been better to have this conversation face to face. But I'm really, really excited to share my work with all of you. The work that I would like to share with you today is based on fieldwork that I've been conducting for the past 3 years in the UK. And this is the perfect time for me to share, and I'm really looking forward to any comments, critiques, insights that you will all have, I hope, towards the end. So I will kick off, and please feel free to write comments, in the chat box or whatever it is. I really cherish all of your insights. Okay, so let's do this. It was an especially cold night as I emerged from the South London tube station on my way to an interfaith event featuring female Islamic art. As I wandered alone towards a side street where the exhibition was taking place, I spotted a Muslim woman with a maroon scarf resting carefully on top of her head. I started walking faster towards her, but then stopped, unsure whether to approach her. A few seconds later, she turned around and saw me. "Sister," she called to me. I rushed ahead to walk with someone I had never met before. We were both relieved. She told me how she stayed on one side of the street, far away from the canal. I kept imagining someone would come and push me into the river. That happened to my friend. As Nasima, my new friend, told me the story, I suddenly realized we were both scared to walk alone, but for very different reasons. I was scared to walk alone at night as a woman, but she was worried to be walking as a visible Muslim. And still, that night we walked together, united in fear. So this paper stems from numerous encounters with women like Nasima, who were all part of my fieldwork among female Jewish and Muslim interfaith activists in the UK. Between 2000 and 2021, I attended over 40 events run by Jewish and Muslim women, and I also conducted 25 in-depth interviews with interfaith activists. And even though public media typically portrays Jewish and Muslim communities at odds, especially vis-a-vis the Israel-Palestine conflict, I was really struck by the powerful alliances these women crafted together amidst growing instances of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in the UK. In this paper, I would like to demonstrate how Jewish and Muslim women forge alliances to fight both inner patriarchy and xenophobia in Britain, especially as it intersects with gender, amidst growing Islamophobic and anti-Semitic incidents in the UK. So in 2019, UK's CST, the Jewish Community Security Trust, recorded the highest total ever recorded of anti-Semitic incidents in a single calendar year, making 2019 the fourth consecutive year in which the annual record has been broken. Tell Mama, the UK's Muslim anti-hate organization, reported that almost 1/3 of the Muslims in their study indicated that Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hate are almost a daily occurrence. The rise of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in the UK is playing out across both political and social domains. This is marked by heated political debates centered on allegations of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia within British mainstream politics, especially recent controversies surrounding anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. As Brexit and nationalism continue to dominate UK politics, minority positionality is a concern for Jews and Muslims alike, but far more for women. Current reports have documented how religious minorities, but especially visibly religious women are struggling, hinting to a gendered dimension of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. My interest in Jewish and Muslim female alliances resonates with Saba Mahmoud's argument that modern secular governance entails fundamental shifts in conceptions of self, time, space ethics, and morality, as well as a reorganization of social, political, and religious life. And what I'm trying to show here today is that, while a lot of these studies, especially kind of intersectional alliances, a lot of them have highlighted national, global, and transnational forms of subordination. But in this paper, I'm really trying to offer an ethnographic lens, highlighting how Jewish and Muslim women create these grassroots alliances in one particular nation state context amidst a turn in British nationalism and Brexit, trends that are, of course, observed more broadly in North America and Europe. So intersectionality, I'm going to talk about intersectionality here for a second and say, intersectionality, as Leslie McCall put it, she said, it might be the most important theoretical contribution that women's studies in conjunction with related fields have made so far. And it's so interesting because even though social inequality has been studied for decades, Crenshaw's attention to the interaction of inequalities created a real paradigm shift. Moving beyond the study of specific forms of inequality, intersectionality offers a multi-dimensional interface which pays attention to the realities of multiple forms of oppression individuals face in society. It's been really interesting to see that since the introduction of intersectionality, it has been used in very diverse settings, leading to a contentious evolution. And I quoted Kimberly Crenshaw here asking, is it a concept, is it a paradigm, a heuristic device, a methodology, or a theory? And really, as intersectionality has traveled, there have been so many questions that have been raised about, the utility and limitations of intersectional metaphors, and of course, the etc. problem that is questioning the numbers of categories and kinds of subjects that can be used as part of intersectional analysis. But for today, I'd like to speak about one category that has been constantly treated with uncertainty, and that is religion. Intersectional scholars have pointed to the importance of conceptualizing religiously based marginalization as part of systems of power and privilege, but they've really struggled to figure out how to study religion. Indeed, inequality along the lines of religion is truly tricky to situate an axis of dominations. I would say for three primary reasons. First, the distinctions between religion, race, and ethnicity, even after several scholarly attempts to offer clear divisions, it remains quite unclear. As a consequence, the intersectional approach itself makes it difficult to single out religious inequality precisely because in concrete situation, religion does intersect with other grounds of inequalities. Second, the power dynamics of a particular religion, both as a social structure and also in personal assemblages of individual agency, of course, changes from place to place. So if you look at evangelical Christianity in the US versus Muslims in India or Jews in France, religion engenders different power dynamics all over the world. So, and the last thing I wanted to say is that even within the same nation state context, religious groups are not unified entities. They are assemblages of people of different classes, ages, gender, races, and ethnicity, which is, of course, a diversity that intersectionality scholars would be especially, I think, inclined to expose. So even though there has been a robust attention to gender and religion within anthropological studies, especially I think we're all familiar with Saba Mahmoud, Laila Abu-Lughod, but only recently have scholars really attempted to incorporate religion within intersectional analysis. And when scholars do incorporate intersectionality, it has typically been within the study of feminist women's movements. And these studies have really shown that while religious women are increasingly part of intersectional movements, these studies show that their own experiences tend to be overlooked or judged by secular feminists. So, vis-a-vis most of this work that has really been focused on the way religion is incorporated within secular feminist groups, what I'm trying to do is really look at the particular ways that religious minorities come together and look at those alliances between religious minorities themselves. So to answer these questions, I'm just going to ask and say that in this study, I'm trying to advance these debates in the anthropological study of religion, gender, and intersectionality by shedding light on the possibilities and limitations of intersectional activism. So what I'm going to try to ask is, how do Jewish and Muslim interfaith activists craft their own alliances? How do they negotiate their interests as a diverse group? And in which circumstances do their interreligious differences hinder possible intersectional alliances? So to answer these questions, I draw on ethnographic data among Jewish and Muslim activists in the UK. And what I'm really trying to do is to capture the various ways Jewish and Muslim women conceptualize and perform diverse identities and interests as two minority groups, the most prominent and growing debates regarding racism and xenophobia in Britain. I'm trying to trace the particular power dynamics. I trace the particular power dynamics gendered religious inequality entails in one particular nation-state context, and examine how minority alliances are formed to create a better future. I look in particular at how they articulate religious inequality in their own terms and how they develop their own interests vis-a-vis other forms of power, such as race, ethnicity, and class. I also explore how they strive to diversify unifying representations of Judaism and Islam. Hence, I investigate, for example, how women from progressive religious backgrounds and more traditional forms of religious belief and practice articulate their goals and negotiate whether their particular religious interests may be represented by women from other religious backgrounds and denominations. So in doing so, I'm trying to shift the analytical focus from the inclusion of religion in secular women's movements to examine alliances between two religious minority groups. So just to go to methods a little bit. So I'm sure that for the people in our crowd today, I'm sure that you all know that Muslims and Jews form a very diverse set of groups. I wouldn't even say one group. And I'm not going to go too much into the background. I'm assuming that you're more familiar with that, but I would like to note something about female leadership. So while female leadership is established in progressive Jewish circles, official leadership in Orthodox Judaism, as well as most Muslim denominations, is still male, with women pursuing leadership through other avenues such as charity, social action, and most relevant to our case today, interfaith. Similarly to other countries, interfaith movements have gained prominence in the UK, especially post 9/11, as a means for social cohesion and potential remedies to religious intolerance and radicalization. Further, while historically interfaith activities have tended to focus on theology, social action initiatives have started to dominate the interfaith scene. Today, transnational networks, state-funded programs, and small-scale neighborhood initiatives act to address a range of social and political issues, including but not limited to religious extremism, poverty, migrant crisis, conflict resolution, etc. So the shift towards social action has had immediate ramifications for women, as it has allowed an entry point for female leadership vis-a-vis the early theological agenda of interfaith, which was predominantly white and male. So this talk today is based on ethnographic findings, as I shared, that are collected as part of a multi-sided ethnography in the UK. I participated in over 40 field observations at female grassroots interfaith activities. I interviewed 40 leaders and participants in different initiatives. And I just want to say that these interfaith participants come from very varied backgrounds different socioeconomic statuses. In fact, many group leaders constantly stressed the concerted effort they put into balancing Jewish and Muslim attendance, and just striving to create diversity as much as possible. So I think, and one last thing is that part of this research was also very much a digital ethnography. After a few months of fieldwork, I was invited to volunteer in one of the main female interfaith initiatives. And I also joined numerous interfaith WhatsApp groups, Facebook groups, whatever I could. And this was really, really powerful because it allowed me to follow both online and offline communications between activists. So we're going to go on to the findings, and I will just say that everything is anonymous, and just to take care of participants who shared sometimes very sensitive information with me. So on a cold, sunny day in November 2018, I made my way to a conference in central London devoted to gendered Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. This gathering was a response to a culmination of upsetting reports on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, which that day was particularly ignited by Luciana Berger's reports on anti-Semitic abuse as a British Labour Democrat politician. Hundreds of activists, leaders, and politicians gathered together to share their experiences of gendered anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and put together a plan to stop the growing incidence of gendered xenophobia. Later that day, while I was having coffee with one of the activists who had been promoting Jewish-Muslim female alliances in her local community over the past years, Daria put into words what I had been thinking all day. She said, 5 years ago, this type of gathering would never have taken place. So as tensions have run high between Jewish and Muslim communities from the United States to Europe to the Middle East, much public media represents Jews and Muslims at odds, especially vis-a-vis the Israel-Palestine conflict, which we will talk about later. But in events like the conferences I attended in November, Jewish and Muslim women came together to share their challenges. The recent rise in interfaith initiatives among particularly Jewish and Muslim women reveals a realignment of forces, of alliances among female religious minorities. So in today's paper, I would really like to examine how Jewish and Muslim women form alliances amidst these growing incidents. First, I would like to show how they create a shared narrative of female solidarity. Second, I will show how they negotiate very different notions and political interests as religious women from very diverse backgrounds. Finally, I would like to expose the limitations of these alliances. It's a cold and rainy night as I get out of the tube and search for the Jewish Museum. I find it easily and walk into a dimmed room for an evening of interfaith storytelling organized by and for women. Scattered around the room in front of me, a group of approximately 40 women are sitting with their faces towards the stage. The back of their heads reveals some hijabs, some Jewish-style headscarves and beret hats, and some women, both Jewish and Muslim, without head coverings at all. A group of 7 women appear on the stage, all wearing black. The women stand in 2 separate groups of 3, with one woman standing directly in between. The women are holding up handmade A4 sized letters covered in silver tinfoil. After a few seconds, I realize these are not random letters. They are spelling the word womb in both Hebrew, rechem, and Arabic, rachem. At this point, Amina, the lady in the middle, asks the woman to move around and change the order of the letters. Playing around with the letters leads to the creation of new words in both Hebrew and Arabic. Starting with rechem, they move to rachim, rachma, ruach, and reach. Everything starts from the womb. This is the first place of compassion. This leads to spirit and to God. Amina, the woman orchestrating the movement, explains to us. She explains the interconnectivity between the linguistic and the spiritual of each of the different meanings of those letters and words as the woman holding the letters move around the room, embodying the letters they represent. So I'm sure you all have a lot to say about this, but I'm going to keep on going, and please write comments if you have more questions. But putting the womb in the center, or rather constructing the womb as the beginning point of everything, seemed, at least to me, as a peculiar way to start an evening of storytelling. As I reflected upon this choice, I realized that this womb origin framework served as both an embodied and metaphorical way to craft meaningful ties between these two groups of very diverse women. As Rachel, one of the storytellers, asked the crowd before she began to tell a Jewish folktale, isn't it wonderful to see how many images and notions of the divine we share? This embodied performance of letters was not merely a warm-up for two highly charismatic women who were the stars of an interfaith storytelling event. This was a constitution of a mutual language, of common roots in femininity, with similar aspirations towards godliness. This was also the constitution of a story of domination and inequality. After this opening, Rachel, the Jewish storyteller, shared an Afghani Jewish folktale about women and their role in social justice. Jamina drummed on her tamuka as she told the Muslim version of the story of Hajar, the Arabic name for the biblical Hagar. The Woolf framework served as a common thread by taking stories from two different traditions and weaving them together into one tapestry. In both cases, the stories selected reflected the choice to highlight female figures that struggled within patriarchy. As captured beautifully in one of the poems read by Sarah, a Muslim poet, at the end of the evening, I'm quoting her, "I am only a woman. I am not the story. I am only a footnote." Second. Yet both storytellers choose to take these footnotes and turn them into full stories that not only offered a humorous and witty evening for a bunch of women, but they also use this to create a renewed sense of belonging within their traditions. The return to the roots of their language and heritage as a shared Jewish-Muslim project was key to many of the interfaith activities I attended. As I joined these sessions and conversed with these women, I was struck by the notion that even though these women experience multiple and simultaneous levels of exclusion, including social class, race, gender, and socioeconomic status, religion served as a lens through which they construct their similarities. I found that female alliances between Jewish and Muslim women were established based on different axes of similarity, and these connections, they did different work in various spheres of their lives. First, they connected women in patriarchal religions to come together to create more opportunities, especially in terms of female leadership. The solidarity Jewish and Muslim women find in each other was also constituted vis-a-vis their mutual alienation among secular feminists. And finally, they aligned forces as two minority groups fighting rising incidents of Islamophobia and antisemitism in the UK. This female solidarity and the focus on the womb was central to the creation of a common story of origin, but it also challenged feminist critiques about female essentialism, which at times made some of the especially younger participants very uncomfortable. Focusing on the womb was also linked the feminine discourse to motherhood, which can also have very excluding effects to anybody who is not a mother. This type of wombhood is premised on prior life experiences unique to married and heterosexual women. These inherent tensions of essentialism reflect long-standing debates among feminist and intersectional scholars who typically critique female essentialism for putting forward cisgendered and heterosexual ideals. As Lila, one of the participants, said painfully, and I'm quoting, "It annoys me when they focus too much on motherhood. It's as if they forget we're not all married just yet." As such, while this discourse seems to include all, it is not really as all-encompassing as it might seem at first glance. The wombhood discourse simultaneously splinters the movement, but also brings it together. So even though British, Jewish, and Muslim women shared a history of social inequality and marginalization in patriarchal religions, their current motivations and hopes for a gender-just future very much vary. While all participants strived for gender equality, they had differing visions of what that might look like and what actions needed to take place for it to happen. These differing visions made intersectional alliances rather tricky. This type of alliance does not resonate the same for women from more progressive backgrounds. In Judaism, reform and conservative groups pray without gender segregation, and in Islam, cultural and more progressive Muslims are advocating to pray without gender segregation at all. The more orthodox parts of Judaism and Islam are still fighting for female leadership, whereas female rabbis and imams are long established in progressive Jewish communities and gaining more traction amongst progressive Muslims. With such fundamental differences, what types of alliances can these diverse groups of women create? The negotiation of multiple types of Jewishness and Muslimness and the question of representation was not just a personal quest. It was a political debate that involved much of the interfaith planning, particularly behind the scenes. During my fieldwork, I attended one of the steering committee meetings where a group of women were organizing an upcoming panel about head covering in Judaism and Islam. As we discussed potential participants, it quickly became clear that this would be a complicated issue. We can't have a panel of women who all cover their head, one of the women cried out. But it's not interesting to hear a story about someone who doesn't have a dilemma. We need to choose women who have had a journey with this, who have had debated about it, was the heated response. After a long meeting, they finally came to a conclusion. There would be Jewish and Muslim women who covered their hair, a Muslim convert who began covering her hair in her 40s, together with a Muslim-born woman who chose not to cover her head. And finally, the panel would be chaired by a secular Jewish woman who never really debated whether or not to cover her head at all. So the diversity was quite clear. This debate was very complicated because the question of representation, particularly through highly politicized practices such as the veil, served as a threat to alliance building. The formation of a panel brings the question of representation to the fore as it involves negotiations of group boundaries and piety hierarchies. As they aimed to represent multiplicity and diversity within each context, they did not want to have one portrait of a Jewish and Muslim woman, yet they also wanted to create a common dilemma that links both Jewish and Muslim women together. I would say that their solidarity was most evident when they were pushing for more female leadership in their faith communities. For example, Asma posted a message on her local Jewish Muslim group WhatsApp with a screenshot of a tweet made by a British MP. That's the picture that you have on the screen today. So in this picture, you can see a group of mainly male faith leaders in a beautifully decorated conference room as they discussed how to better integrate refugees in the UK. Asma shared this picture with her group and asked, "Shall we retweet with a polite reminder that we need more women around these tables?" Linda, a Jewish educator, quickly responded, "Ouch." And Shada said, "We should definitely do something together." So for the next few hours, the WhatsApp group members shared stories about the exclusion of women in their communities, as many cannot take part in the official leadership roles of their communities. And to put it simply, they felt that they rarely had a seat around the table. These types of frustrations mirror the complexities of women in conservative religions who decide to stay even as gender equality awareness grows. And again, even though they experience multiple levels of exclusion, it is through their religious commonality that Jewish and Muslim learn to perform, I would say, their feminism, but I typically call it female alliances because not everybody speaks about their own identity as feminists, which we can speak about later. But their solidarity is especially meaningful as they both struggle to find welcoming spaces to voice their frustrations in secular feminist organizations. Harim, for example, shared how she wanted to participate in a feminist panel, but the organizer laughed at her head covering and said, "I don't think people would be very interested in hearing your perspective." Harim's story, which she shared with me very painfully, reflects the quest for existence and acceptance of a head covering feminist Muslim woman in a world of secular-based feminism. And I'm linking here to Kristen On's work in the UK, clearly resonating Saba Mahmoud's claims regarding Western binaries of agency versus religion. Women like Harim wish to participate in feminist dialogues and projects, but are not allowed access due to their visibly religious practices. However, female interfaith initiatives enable a space to cultivate the constantly evolving identity of a religious feminist. I would like us to move on to the third part of this talk, and I want to speak a little bit about the limitations of alliances. So, while different feminist agendas were met with creative ways to align forces, there were also sometimes really deep differences that linger around dangerously, threatening to ruin the bridges and relationships these encounters carefully formed. So, in this final section, I turn to discuss the big elephant in the room, to quote many of my participants, the Israel-Palestine conflict. So Charlotte, a Muslim who is a very active and especially vocal leader of interfaith activities, told me about the way she deals with the Israel-Palestine challenge. You know, I grew up in the UK, and you hear terrible things about the Middle East, but I always said to myself, we do not need to focus on it here. This was my mantra. We can't let the craziness there dictate the relationships we form here. But you know, the more I get to know Jewish women, the more I realize it is not so simple. Every Jewish woman I have met has a connection with Israel. It may be a complicated one, but they are connected, and I had not realized the extent of that beforehand. So Charlotte describes this transformation she goes through during her interfaith engagement. It's through personal encounters that she realizes that British Jewish women are inextricably connected to Israel, and hence the Israel-Palestine issue cannot really be put aside. The strategy she employed, like many other women I met, was to wait, foster relationships, and only then can it be discussed, usually in private conversations or in mediated and careful discussion groups. Ilana, for example, gave a detailed account of the transformative experience entailed in discussing these issues with a Muslim counterpart. After the session, she says, Jade and I had a conversation. We were just having coffee. They made space for that, and I told her about a friend of mine who was killed in a bus bombing in Israel-Palestine. She died at age 20. When she was killed, all of her organs were fine and were donated to the hospital, which had a long list of Jews, Palestinians. I was talking to her about this. So she was blown up by a Palestinian, yet many of her organs went to Palestinian children. Jade could not believe this. Not only that, we spoke about triage in hospitals, and after a terrorist attack, if a terrorist gets there first, he will be treated before the people he tried to kill. We spoke about hospitals as sites of interfaith, as a real, anyway, and she said to me, why don't I know these stories? And it works in the other direction as well. I have had moments, about the way that Palestinians are treated. I was not given those stories. We know that history is not a subject, it's a commentary, it's an interpretation. These are painful moments, but transformative ones as well. So through my fieldwork, I learned that one of the main strategies utilized by interfaith activists was to broach sensitive issues carefully in contingent and situated ways. Hence, it's only after a relationship based on similarities and solidarity has been crafted that one can move on to more contentious topics. Jade and Ilana knew each other for quite a while and had already formed a solid relationship. During an informal coffee break, they both shared their perspectives and experiences about Israel-Palestine, and it changed both of them profoundly. They were putting together pieces of information that they did not really have the same access to in their home communities without their encounters with others. As Linda said, you cannot have the same thoughts about Israel-Palestine after interfaith. It always changes you. For both of them, this interfaith exchange marks and rethinks the channels of selective knowledge offered to both sides. And they use their encounter to challenge that. As Sabiha told me, growing up, I'm quoting from here, growing up, all I had ever heard of was Israel. Now I understand that there is such a thing called Israel. I have not become an advocate for Israel, but I have a different perspective than many of my friends. Sabiha's powerful statement reflects a pro-Palestinian discourse of human rights abuses that are reconfigured in interfaith settings. I'd like to give you an example. During one of the sessions I attended, I watched as an experienced interfaith activist, Dina, began a group discussion about the Middle East conflict. Dina walked into the room and immediately said, "We need to set this room up differently. If we want to talk about this differently as women," I'm quoting, "we must change the way we sit. This is the only way we can have a conversation. If we don't want things to explode, we need to sit in a circle, not in rows. We want to have a real talk. We want to be able to have a real conversation. I also want to set some proper conversation rules, or we will never get out of the depressing whirlpool, just like everyone else." So Dina, very assertively, she demonstrates her expertise in handling difficult conversations as she offers a spatial change to set up the room differently, together with new rules to stimulate a better, or different, as she puts it, conversation about the Middle East. An analysis of her discourse reveals how she constantly uses the term we versus them. In other words, those who are caught up in a whirlpool with no real conversation possibilities. This boundary work constructs a dialogical and fruitful feminine circle vis-a-vis unproductive rows used by everyone else and especially men, which this type of discourse simultaneously reifies very essentialized notions about gender and conversation capabilities, as well as group boundaries. So even though interfaith activists really tried hard to find ways to converse about the Middle East, they stayed clear from commenting on political events, as well as acting and supporting either sides as a collective. I found it really interesting to see that when a Muslim or a Jew was killed in any place in the world, with the striking exception of Israel-Palestine, the group solidarity and public display of support was extremely heartwarming. While grassroots activism typically focused on local activism, they come together when an exceptionally troubling international event occurs. My WhatsApp and Facebook were overloaded when targeted attacks occurred in mosques or synagogues like Christchurch or Pittsburgh. For example, Nisa Nashim, the largest Muslim female interfaith initiative, put out a statement, and I put part of it on this for you, to condemn the synagogue slaughter while framing the attacks as anti-Semitic, anti-woman, and anti-immigration. They wrote, and this is what we have here: "We are stronger together. We will stand as allies to call out bigotry and intolerance and to acknowledge and understand what can happen when hatred goes unchecked." So Nisa Nashim, like many other British Jews and Muslims, stood together at vigils, sent letters and flowers as tokens of solidarity. This was common, in fact, when any anti-Muslim hate or anti-Jewish hate occurred anywhere around the world. Yet whenever anything was connected to Israel-Palestine, there was a tacit compartmentalization to the private sphere. Even though there was, of course, no official policy, I think that they felt that in order to build their local alliances, they must avoid this topic, which could potentially splinter their solidarity. Thus, there's a constant act of boundary making between here and there through what they do and say, and when they decide to remain silent. This boundary making was not incidental. It was a product of effort and concerted work. In fact, it raises a really important question that I think is really central to intersectional activism. How is selective avoidance accounted for when it is antithetical to the aims of intersectional activism, which seeks to account for all axes of oppression? In this case, how could it be that activists concerned with equality would put aside an issue that is constantly portrayed as extreme inequality? On both sides, primarily the human rights of the Palestinians on the one hand, and attacks on Israeli Jews as they constitute legitimate political targets of self-protection on the other. Ruth Sheldon has demonstrated how Israel-Palestine has come to be a key conflict among students in British universities, exacerbating tensions regarding the freedom of expression within legal frameworks of the nation state. So just to be clear, I do not think that the differences between campus politics and the middle-aged woman I studied reflect merely an age difference. There are many advocates of Palestine and Israel who do not join interfaith dialogue, largely because of this big elephant. In fact, some vocal advocates of Israel and Palestine publicly critique these alliances. These pushbacks were often discussed by interfaith activists who shared such incidents and thought together how to best address these tensions. For example, after a really well-attended interfaith event appeared in a British newspaper, a photo and critique was uploaded by a pro-Palestinian blogger. While a few newcomers in the group were surprised and actually offended, the others comforted them, reminding them that these critiques will always continue. But, and here I'm quoting, there is so much more that unites us than separates us, which is the dominant narrative between our faiths. So such statements reflect, though, that their unity is contingent, uniting them only to a certain point. So just to conclude and open up for some questions, interfaith activists in the UK have developed new and somewhat surprising alliances. Amidst growing instances of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in the UK, these Jewish-Muslim alliances reflect a reconfiguration of power dynamics among two minority groups who have been at the heat of xenophobic discourse and rhetoric, both in everyday life and within mainstream British politics. So this paper shifts the analytical focus of research on religion and intersectionality from the inclusion of religion in secular women's movements to examine alliances between two religious minority groups. I have shown how Jewish and Muslim women very creatively craft together a shared her story, influencing the ways they fight intercommunal patriarchy and British racism and xenophobia together. In doing so, I highlight how they articulate an inequality in their own terms, while negotiating their interests as a diverse group, making sure to represent multiple and diverse portraits of Jewish and Muslim women. I have also pointed to some of the limitations of these intersectional alliances, mainly the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Examining Jewish-Muslim female alliances provides a vital perspective on understandings of intersectional alliances, especially their limitations. Based on my findings, I argue that female alliances are a crucial tool to build a better future, but these alliances are always contingent. For Jewish and Muslim women, Israel-Palestine is a clear and constant source of conflict that threatens to undermine their alliances, and it will probably remain so until peace in the Middle East is resolved. However, the Jewish and Muslim women I met, the ones who decided to join forces and fight xenophobia in Britain, believed that their coming together was more important, perhaps more urgent for them at this particular moment in time. For them, these alliances proved that it wasn't Judaism or Islam that was the problem. Together, they were able to point to growing nationalism, and Brexit, of course, as the main perpetrator of xenophobia in Britain. To expose this logic, they truly believe they are stronger together, to paraphrase Audre Lorde. These findings resonate with Saba Mahmoud's argument that modern secular governance entails fundamental shifts in conceptions of self, time, space, ethics, and morality, as well as a reorganization of social, political, and religious life. I argue that these types of alliances between religious minorities are best perceived, this is what I'm calling it, as intersectional conscious activism. Even though intersectionality is typically utilized as a framework for social theory or as a critical feminist practice of social justice, I suggest to think about intersectionality as a type of consciousness. By thinking about intersectionality as a mode of thinking, or perhaps a mode of inspiration, I call for intersectional analysis that goes beyond the examinations of personal behavior, public policy, or direct outcomes of intersectional politics. In this paper, I'm trying to offer an ethnographic analysis of grassroots alliance building while highlighting their successes, their limitations, and perhaps maybe their failures. But in doing so, however, I foreground intersectionality as an ideal that lingers and inspires activism, even if full equality remains an unachievable horizon.